Hey folks, Craig Danger, vinyl record player. Oh, back again, 1969. Is it the best year in music ever? I believe Craig Danger has a valuable and valid case. So please, sit back, listen to the testimony, consider the facts, and also, buckle up. And we're back. We're talking about 1969 today in the continuing series. Is this year the best year in music ever? We're talking about 1969. I've got 10 reasons today. I may make it 11, I may make it 12, because it's just how weird and dangerous we're willing to get here at Craig Danger, the vinyl record player. Let's just start out with reason number one. Obviously, wasn't there 1969, but I believe the musical event of the year could only be the Woodstock Festival of 1969. No, I'm not speaking of the blatant rip-off that was 1994 or 1999, both which were apparently quite terrible. There actually was a great documentary on the Woodstock 99 that was just like, oh, woo, what a cash grab, baby. No, this was the original, and in fact there's also a Academy Award winning documentary from 1970 on the 1969 Woodstock Festival, a 3-day event in Bethel, New York, featuring basically a who's who. Almost everyone was there at the time. Creedence was there. The Who were there. Huge, a band that got huge because of it. 10 years after, Hendrix, Joan Baez. If you can name an artist in the late 60s, they were there. It sort of encapsulated what was a real sort of hippie summer of love sort of a jam. Certainly it did not go off without a hitch, but Woodstock is pretty well known in culture and counterculture as sort of one of those huge events that really is a little bit myth, but really a lot of just amazing music, and really kind of set the tone for a generation, or so it was thought. Funny thing is that as Woodstock portrayed the hippie generation at its most loving with its best music, of course, the end of that supposed generation and the beginning of the dark and cold 70s really would occur in December of 1969 near Tracy, California at the Altamont Speedway, wherein the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, Flying Burrito Brothers, and I believe the Jefferson Airplane, amongst others, I think Santana was there too, basically took part in a free concert that would be one of the biggest disasters, and really the portrait of a 1970 film, Gimme Shelter, which, by the way, that is a must watch. It's got some great footage of the Altamont Festival, and also just some interesting stuff with like Keith and Mick going, oh, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe it. It was not good. Someone got shot. There was bad acid everywhere. The Hells Angels were security, and unfortunately no one told the Hells Angels, hey, look at the security handbook, you gotta stay professional. So they started beating people with pool cues. One guy died, at least one guy died. It was raining, it was terrible. So that kind of symbolized really the end of the decade for many. And, I would say it's kind of a third festival of the year. Really, and in terms of lineup, also great. How about the 1969 Isle of Wight Festival, which would begin a series, I believe, of 3 up until 71 of amazing festivals on the Isle of Wight in England with just lineups. Oh, beautiful lineups. I think there was much less havoc, a huge item, and sort of, again, another festival to sort of close out the 60s and bring in the brooding, dark 1970s. So for number 2, this is just something that always has to be brought up. Obviously, number 2, we can only be speaking of the Beatles, who on, I believe it was January 30th, recorded their infamous concert on the roof at Apple Records. Obviously, that would be in the recent documentary, Get Back, but also in the film Let It Be. The band was not getting along by that point. Yoko was in the studio. Things were happening. Not necessarily all great things, and basically the Let It Be tapes were sort of brought together. Again, if you do have an opportunity to see the recent Get Back documentary, really a fantastic picture of that, and just restored fantastically by Peter Jackson, who of course is also directed the infamous and famous Lord of the Rings films. So I mean, it's just an immaculate documentary. I'm not even the biggest Beatles fan, as you can tell by my lack of a copy of what album? Abbey Road. They released Abbey Road this year, which of course I do have on compact disc. But you know what? Really, in my opinion, one of their best albums, if not my favorite Beatles album, Abbey Road. It would be, of course, their second last album before Let It Be. But again, obviously a classic cover, Crossing the Road. And just really a legendary sort of semi-final document. There are many in the Beatles-loving community who are a little bit about Let It Be. And again, who am I to argue? But number 2 of the year has to be the Beatles, and certainly just all the activity around the Beatles and Apple Records, etc., etc. For number 3, we can only turn to the soul music equivalent of the Beatles, and that could only be who? How about the Supremes? How about Diana Ross and the Supremes, cream of the crop? Now, this is not really the reason why, the Supremes were such a massive story this year. In fact, it was simply because, unfortunately, this would be their last album with Diana Ross, who would go on to a fuller solo career, basically, for the rest of the 70s and 80s and even 90s. She had a very long career, but this, of course, would be her last album with them. And the last single, one of their best songs, written by Johnny Bristol, a legendary jam, Someday We'll Be Together, which of course is on this one. This album, again, I picked this one up in the dollar bin. This is not one where I'd be like, oh, you gotta get it. Funny thing about Someday We'll Be Together also is that, Johnny Bristol, obviously a little bit of background vocals on that jam. Woo! You can tell he's kind of like the gospel shouter in the background. Just kind of, it's good. It's good. That's all I'm saying. But this album is it is what it is, but it sort of signaled the end of an era for the Supremes, where they'd have a few more hits, but without being powered by Diana, unfortunately, their career would begin to go on the downward slope after really spending most of the 1960s in the top 10. One of certainly the biggest selling act on Motown in a decade that was punctuated by what? The Beatles, the British Invasion, and of course, mostly Motown. So number 2, the end of the Supremes. And of course, funny thing, of course, about Someday We'll Be Together, the other Supremes, not on it. As a matter of fact, it was just Diana Ross and a different group of background singers. So, is what it is. A very sort of unceremonious end to really a legendary band. Nothing but hits across the mid and a little bit in the early 60s. So yeah, I have to say number 3, the parting of Diana Ross and the Supremes. Neither of them would be the same, although to be fair, Diana would continue and basically blow the doors off for the next quite a while. Number 4 can only be King Crimson. Of course, in the court of the Crimson King. This, of course, is known basically across the board. If you're a prog fan, you know this album, you love this album. This is sort of, I guess, really a giving birth almost. Whereas I did say in 67 that the Moody Blues, classic, legendary Days of Future Past, may have really sort of set the seeds. This is the full birthing effect as a baby pops out in the shape of In the Court of the Crimson King. Kind of a must listen, really a sort of a legendary prog classic, but again, I think it sort of set a few of the parameters that bands like The Nice, that Procol Harum, that others would sort of take from there and extend the prog sound, which basically until about 74, there was a lot of prog, and really it is mainly, I think, because of the giant record that, of course, is In the Court of the Crimson King, which is, of course, my number 4. Number 5, who invents punk rock? Who invents punk rock? I might get some problems with this, because, there are those who might say, well, Craig, it was the Sonics, it was Question Mark and the Mysterians, it was garage. I'm going to get a little bit, closer to the truth with that, and I would say the Stooges, absolutely legendary LP. from 1969. Iggy Pop, first appearance, really an absolutely legendary record, cover to cover. There's one or two songs that, yeah, we could do without. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a perfect album. It is far from it, and certainly there's some drony bits on the Stooges, but certainly, I believe, really kind of set the tone for punk rock, basically for the next decade. Obviously, from here, also the MC5 would release Kick Out the Jams this year, sort of a classic live album, and basically another sort of springboard from punk. From there, you get the New York Dolls, then the Ramones, and then basically you get punk. So it's impossible to talk about 1969 and not talk about the Stooges. The Stooges, which again is an absolutely legendary album. And since we're talking about punk, let's talk about the absolute antithesis. And let's talk, of course, about jazz. How about Miles Davis in a Silent Way from 1969? In my opinion, one of Miles' best, if not his absolute best. This album would come before sort of his break into fusion, a little more of a rocking style, a little bit less of this old school sort of a bop feel that he had for quite a good period of time. But yeah, this album is about 40 minutes, 2 tracks, In a Silent Way by Miles Davis. Ooh, classic one I actually ended up buying. This is on the Columbia label. I ended up buying this new. It's pretty much impossible to find an original copy. But as a matter of fact, vinyl community legend, of course, Vinyl Richie actually introduced me to this one. And this is one that really, if you're a jazz person or you're not, absolute, incredible 40-minute groove. Really, like I say, only 2 songs. But in my opinion, Miles Davis, who was really at kind of another peak in his career, would release this album, In a Silent Way. Ooh, and that, of course, is my number 6. Okay, so who is at number 7? I know you're asking yourself, hey, Craig Danger, who's the master of the number 2 Billboard hit? Well, that, of course, could only be our friends, Creedence Clearwater Revival. This is Bayou Country right here. One of 3 albums they would release this year. Obviously, as I mentioned before, they would also appear at Woodstock, but not in the film. This, of course, is Green River, another of their 3 albums. And then, of course, Willie and the Poor Boys would round it out. 3 albums and basically just a chock full of number 2 hits. Creedence, of course, never had a number 1 hit, but just, I think it was something like 7 or 8 over the career. Number 2 hits. Of course, this would be the first year that singles would not only count the A-side, but also the B-side on the Billboard charts as far as radio play went. So that changed the game actually quite a bit. But again, monster year for Creedence, and really, this is a band that would not last too much longer. But wow, you want to talk about fantastic material. 3 albums worth of material in 1969, plus the Woodstock Festival. I can only say Creedence is the number 7 reason why. When you put out 3 legendary LPs in 1 year, I mean, I believe that counts as kind of a big thing. And at number 8, of course, I, as Craig Danger, have to talk my own book and talk about the release of the most underrated soul LP of the decade. Could only be Soul Portrait by Willie Hutch. Back to back, cover to cover, absolutely legendary, produced by John Flores for the RCA label. Proceeded to sell absolute buckets, but wow, bangers from cover to cover on this one. In my opinion, unfortunately, sold nothing, and you can talk to 1 million critics, and 999,000 of them will be like, Willie who? Not this one. Old Craig Danger is back in Willie, and I'm calling this the most underrated 60s LP, and in fact, a top 3 LP of the decade. Also this year, wow, who almost invents progressive soul? How about a little bit of hot buttered soul? How about Isaac Hayes? Having parted with his songwriting partner, David Porter, who of course were very famous for writing pretty much all the great songs of Sam and Dave, he just decides to go solo. This, of course, is his 2nd album. His first one, I think it's called Introducing. It's not so good. It's a little bit jammy, a little jazzy, but here he really absolutely blows the doors off. We're talking symphonic breaks. We're talking 12-minute, just long, funky jams. And of course, that sweet, elegant Isaac Hayesian voice. This, of course, in my opinion, one of the best soul albums ever made, probably a top 5. It changed the direction of soul in a very positive, funky, but again, also sophisticated way. Full string arrangements on this, incredible drumming. This is just absolute, the arrangements on this, an absolute killer. I think we're talking about like 4 or 5 tracks on this whole LP, but a win and a full-length LP of legendary note. And then, of course, what else can we say? How about the debut First Take from Roberta Flack? In my opinion, possibly her best album. But again, this would introduce the basically one of the best song interpreters in the 1970s. In 1969, of course, this album sold somewhat a bucket right around then. And it wasn't until 71, 72's Play Misty for Me, when, of course, the first time I saw Your Face, which was, of course, on this album, would bring this album up, and it would begin to sell copies by the fistful. But in 69, it was released, and if you were in the know in 69, you definitely picked up Roberta Flack's First Take. So that's the soul of this time. Number 9, well, obviously hard rock, having seen 68 with Steppenwolf. We can only really speak of something I don't have a hard copy of, and that could be Led Zeppelin 1, which I think pretty much everyone is... it's hard to disagree that this absolutely changed the realm of hard rock, and really, I won't talk too much about the album. Everyone's already talked about it. But you know what I will talk about is, in my opinion, the best hard rock album ever. I could only be speaking of Fleetwood Mac and Peter Green's Then Play On. This is, of course, a cover-to-cover Majesty, released in 69. It would be their last album as this derivation of the Fleetwood Mac featuring Peter Green. Of course, there would be a lot of problems with Fleetwood Mac throughout their history, but in this period, there was certainly issues with bad drugs, Germans, and just concerts gone off the hill. Of course, by 71, 72, not only would Peter Green be gone from the band, Danny Kirwan would also be gone, and throughout that early 70s period, there would be a lot of member swaps until they became, and of course, the Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, and Christine McVie Fleetwood Mac. Of course, though, again, this one is a legendary LP, and in my opinion, I'm about to throw it down, I'm going to say it is the best hard rock LP ever. That's right. And also as an addendum to the hard rock scene, I think it's also important to take a look at Tommy by The Who, which of course was a huge album and really the first official rock opera. And then of course the Kinks would have Arthur, or The Decline and Fall of the British Empire. Again, an absolute crusher of an album featuring the epic Victoria, which is one of my favorite songs ever, really. And at number 10, we'll close it out. Obviously, some very important albums this year, including the debut of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, who would basically change a lot of music, and folk rock, certainly with their harmonies. And wow, it's a fantastic album. In my opinion, I think this is still their best album. Obviously, tons of sort of classics on this. You Don't Have to Cry, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. I mean, cover to cover, this is a fantastic album. Also, who would come out with another classic in 69? How about Nashville Skyline? Bob Dylan. This is country rock from basically end to end. This is Bob Dylan's real sort of grinding into the country rock scene, recorded in Nashville with all Nashville players. And of course, also, Girl from the North Country, a duet with Johnny Cash, which I think is one of his most legendary tunes. And then finally to end off sort of the folk side of 1969, and also to cap off the entire year at number 10, I would also reference Nick Drake, 5 Leaves Left. He, of course, would have a legacy of 3 LPs, phenomenally influential and really fantastic and individual sounding LPs. 5 Leaves Left would be his first one. But of course, he would go on to Brighter Later and Pink Moon before, unfortunately, passing away of, I think it was suicide in about 72 after his final LP, Pink Moon. But 5 Leaves Left is, wow, there's really not really anything like it in terms of folk LPs, and yeah, it's hugely influential, and I think, frankly, one of the best albums of 1969. So, woo, that's it. That's my case. How do I stand, jury? Like, subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me what's great about 69. What do you think is missing in 69? What's your favorite LP from that year? And hey, tell me what I'm missing, because I know I'm missing a lot. It's a hell of a year. As I continue with this series, it's only going to get harder and harder.